Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Atrophy of Soul, and I'm here today to talk about one of my favorite video game franchises of all time. That's right, we are here to talk about Devil May Cry. It's been quite a long while since we've gotten a new game in the hack and slash genre that can rival this series in terms of mechanical complexity and player freedom. Even the progeny of the franchise that was developed to spiritually succeed DMC's legacy pales in comparison to what this series was able to achieve and introduce to gamers everywhere over its very limited time in the limelight. The original Devil May Cry series, sans DMC2, are to this day the most mechanically rich experiences that you will ever have the pleasure of experiencing within the genre. Attempting to master these games is a perpetual struggle against your own personal shortcomings as an individual. If you are willing to put in the time and effort, the series will reward you with the contextual dexterity to create some of the most imaginative, layered, and rewarding options ever coded onto any form of media. In spite of its overarching influence on the industry in its entirety, the Devil May Cry series has had a tumultuous history of being mishandled and misunderstood by both gamers and game developers alike. As industry trends continue to prioritize style over substance with the scores of new gaming hobbyists entering the industry each year, we are seeing once preeminent franchises quote-unquote casualize in order to cater to a wider demographic. Titles once thought to be derivatives of Devil May Cry are somehow even further diluting themselves for the sake of mass appeal. God of War 4 being the perfect illustration of this worrying trend, with a by-the-numbers story over gameplay design philosophy that does very little to keep players engaged once the credits finally roll, and with core game mechanics that make Skyrim's combat look like Ninja Gaiden's by comparison. There is no doubt that the AAA industry cares very little about contextually engaging players with intricate and alluring gameplay systems. Even the DMC franchise is guilty of dumbing itself down to the point of irrelevance with the much maligned and bloviating back alley abortion that was Ninja Theory's DMC Devil May Cry. To be fair, even the classic franchise is guilty of this trend to a degree, given that certain design elements presented within DMC4 SE are indicative of this style over substance design philosophy. The inclusion of overpowered super moves, such as Judgment Cut End, offset the gameplay balance, allowing inexperienced and lazy players to solely rely on these attacks in order to overcome difficult situations. While the introduction of a super move such as Judgment Cut End is a great way of expanding a player's palette for creativity and experimentation, there needs to be a sense of equanimity that players must maintain in order for these attacks to feel rewarding and decisive to pull off. If there is little to no risk for activating such a powerful attack, then most players will use it as a crutch, further emaciating their need to experiment with the full set of options that they have at their disposal. This issue could have easily been ameliorated if Virgil's Judgment Cut End could only be activated with a fully charged Devil Trigger and concentration meter, and if the attack itself resulted in a completely depleted DT meter. This simple change would force players to choose between pulling off a Judgment Cut End for significant damage, or remaining in Devil form for vastly improved maneuverability and damage output. Devil May Cry has always primarily been about making yourself look as stylish as possible through substantive mechanics. If the mechanics that players have access to aren't cultivating an environment where efficiency and mechanical mastery are rewarded, then very few players will take it upon themselves to delve any further into the combat system than necessary. While DMC4 SE only contains a few small elements that undermine its mechanical complexity, the very existence of these elements should be identified so as to inhibit the developers from further expanding on such lazy design philosophies. There's a difference between accessibility and oversimplification that most game designers can't seem to distinguish between. Not all things can be understood by everyone, so instead of attempting to cater to everyone, cater to those who are so inclined to be interested in understanding what it is that you are producing. A fair example of the difference between accessibility and oversimplification lies in the very existence of Nero. Nero as a character and the gameplay systems associated with him is an obvious attempt from the developers to strike a balance between accessibility and mechanical depth. There's much to be said about Nero's anemic gameplay when compared directly to characters such as Virgil or Dante. However, the combat system that Nero comes equipped with is brimming with potential that the developers fail to realize. This is likely due in part to to Devil May Cry 4's forced development schedule, which left the game half-finished with a number of ideas being discarded in order to make sure that the game was released on time. While Nero's potential shines through in spite of mechanics which are obviously lacking, if he were to be fleshed out a little further, I believe that he could have been the perfect way to ease new players into the series. As of now, Nero only comes equipped with the Red Queen, Blue Rose, Devil Bringer, and a Devil Trigger, which makes the Yamato accessible. Nero gives players access to a gameplay system that is highly concentrated, condensing the essence of Devil May Cry into one fundamental property: timing. Nero's basic set of attacks cleverly instruct players to be wary of animation frames with the Exceed and Max Axe systems respectively, helping to implicitly elucidate the importance of mechanical mastery. While all of these elements are a great first step for facilitating the impetus for inquiry within players, once these mechanics are fully understood, there is very little freedom for creativity in regards to the core system that Nero has on display when compared directly to other characters, namely Dante. If Nero were given access to alternate weapons that could be swapped on the fly and a Devil Bringer that allowed him to perform a greater number of attacks, he would have been a crucial link between he and Dante, making the transition between the two characters much less jarring and much more accommodating to players unfamiliar with the Devil May Cry series. As of now, players who felt as though DMC4 was worse than even DMC Devil May Cry are lacking in an integral understanding of the mechanical complexity that DMC4 allows players access to, due in large part to how unsuccessfully the game designers attempted to communicate this complexity with Nero. On the whole, a character such as Nero isn't necessary to accommodate for the ignorance of new players. The mechanics of Devil May Cry can easily be communicated through gameplay progression, just like in previous titles in the series, and the more intricate mechanics can also be communicated in this very way. For instance, if we were to expunge Nero's existence from the entirety of the series, but wanted to successfully teach players complex mechanics such as on-the-fly weapon switching, jump canceling, or on-the-fly style switching, we'd simply place players in the role of a Dante with a very limited moveset. We would first only allow access to one melee weapon, one projectile weapon, and one style. Players would initially only be able to choose between the main four styles: Swordmaster, Gunslinger, Trickster, and Royal Guard. However, they would not be able to switch between these styles on the fly initially until said style has been mastered. For instance, once Swordmaster has been fully upgraded, players will unlock an extra style slot that allows them to map the second style onto the D-pad buttons. In this instance, the player will be able to switch between two styles: Swordmaster, which is now fully upgraded, and the new style that they'd like to level. Of course, once they level up the second style, it will permanently become part of their repertoire just like the Swordmaster style did, and they will once again unlock another slot to map a third style onto, and so on and so forth. By limiting access to each of the primary styles, it gives players ample time to learn their individual strengths and weaknesses, slowly allowing them to learn the basics of style switching while progressing through the game at a consistent pace. In this way, instead of teaching players the importance of mechanical complexity whilst stifling player freedom like Nero did in DMC4, the player is taught the importance of mechanical complexity while slowly increasing their palette for creativity organically, without constraints. As demonstrated, communicating to players the intricacies of the combat system can be achieved through moment-to-moment gameplay by slowly adding layers to the system through progression. While it is indeed important to elucidate mechanics with clarity, it is just as important for players to feel accomplished in discovering these nuances so as to spark inspiration. By lowering the skill ceiling, you constrain player freedom. By constraining player freedom, you betray the core principle of the Devil May Cry series, which is style through substance. Making sure that the core gameplay of the series continues to push the envelope should always be of utmost importance to the developers. There is nothing about Devil May Cry that can't be understood without willingness, but there is plenty that can be adulterated by catering to laziness, hence DMC Devil May Cry's existence. We should discourage derivatives and rehashes of prior entries in the series, whilst clamoring for another evolutionary step forward in terms of the core systems in place. A successful extension of the franchise would be a title that made Devil May Cry 3 and 4 seem as antiquated as the original Devil May Cry does today by comparison. There are plenty of ways that this can be achieved, but first and foremost, the devs should be building upon the precedent set by the previous entries in the franchise, as opposed to expunging them for the sake of appeal. Mechanical complexity and accessibility are not mutually exclusive propositions, but without the proper implementation, they may very well be treated as such. With that said, what are your thoughts on titles that trade mechanical complexity for mass appeal? Do you feel that the industry tries too hard to cater to the lowest common denominator? Have you noticed a steady decline in titles worth putting sufficient time into? Are you afraid that the developers may dumb down a potential Devil May Cry 5? Have your favorite franchises declined in quality over the years? Whatever your thoughts are, be sure to comment below and let me know what you think. Once again, my name is Atrophy of Soul. Thank you very kindly for listening, and be sure to have yourselves a fine day.